I spent 43 years, convinced I was learning to become a tracker. But sitting here now, at 71 years old, I understand the truth that's kept me silent for over 4 decades. I wasn't learning to track. I was being taught to see. And my teacher wasn't human. My name is Marcus Webb, and what I'm about to share with you has never been recorded, never been published, never been whispered to anyone outside of a few trusted souls who've since passed on. I've carried this story like a stone in my chest, heavy and smooth from years of private contemplation. But time is running short, and some truths are too important to take to the grave. This story begins in 1981. I was 28 years old, recently discharged from the Army Rangers after serving 2 tours in places I still can't talk about. The military had given me purpose, structure, a reason to wake up every morning. Civilian life offered none of that. I came home to suburban Ohio, to a wife who'd become a stranger during my deployments, to a warehouse job that paid the bills but hollowed out my soul one shift at a time. My marriage was falling apart in slow motion. Sarah didn't understand why I couldn't just be normal, couldn't just settle into the quiet rhythm of regular American life. Truth was, I couldn't explain it myself. The silence of our small house felt louder than any combat zone. The routine felt like drowning. I was lost in a way I'd never been lost in the jungle, because at least there the danger was external. Back home the enemy lived inside my own head. My one escape was the woods. Every weekend I could manage, I'd pack up my 1978 Ford F-150 and drive to whatever patch of forest I could find within a few hours. I'd hike until my legs burned and my mind finally quieted. It wasn't therapy in any clinical sense, but it was the only thing keeping me tethered to sanity. Then one evening, thumbing through an outdoor magazine at the pharmacy, I stumbled across an article about wilderness tracking. The author described following deer through Pennsylvania forests, reading their stories in bent grass and pressed earth. Something about those words hit me like a revelation. Here was a skill that demanded everything I was good at: patience, observation, methodical thinking, but turned it towards something peaceful, something constructive. I bought every book I could find. Tom Brown Jr. The Tracker became my Bible. I devoured field guides on animal prints, studied pressure releases and stride patterns until the pages fell loose from their bindings. For the first time since coming home, I felt a spark of genuine purpose. I decided I needed to do this properly. Not weekend trips to Ohio state parks, but a real expedition. Total immersion. A buddy from my service days had mentioned the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, described it as the closest thing to untouched wilderness left in the lower 48. Old-growth forest, diverse wildlife, endless terrain to explore. I found a cheap cabin rental near a town called Forks, told Sarah I needed a month to figure some things out, and pointed my truck west. The drive across America took 5 days, and I watched the landscape transform outside my windshield like a slow-motion miracle. The flat farmlands of the Midwest gave way to the rolling plains, then the dramatic thrust of the Rockies, and finally the lush, impossible green of the Pacific Northwest. When I first glimpsed the Olympic Mountains rising through the mist, something caught in my throat. They looked ancient, eternal, like they'd been waiting for me. I arrived in late September 1981. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with rain that seemed perpetual here. The air smelled different than anywhere I'd ever been: cedar and moss, and something older, something that spoke of millennia of uninterrupted growth. I checked into a rustic cabin, owned by an old-timer named Harlan Creech, a leathery 73-year-old who'd spent his whole life in these forests, first as a logger, then as something harder to define. Harlan regarded me with the measuring look old men give to young ones they're not sure about. When I told him I was here to practice tracking, his eyebrows rose just slightly. He asked what I planned to track, and I told him everything: deer, elk, bear, whatever left prints. I wanted to read the forest like a book. His response has stayed with me all these years. He nodded slowly, looked out at the wall of trees beyond his property and said, "These woods will teach you things if you let them. Just remember, some things out there they track back." At the time I thought he was being colorful, local flavor for the tourist from Ohio. I thanked him for the advice and headed to my cabin to unpack, eager to start my education the next morning. Those first days humbled me quickly. I'd studied the theory of tracking in books, memorized the shapes of prints and the patterns of gaits, but the actual forest was overwhelming in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was just so much information. Every square foot of ground held dozens of potential stories, and I couldn't separate signal from noise. The silence took getting used to as well, and I quickly learned it wasn't really silence at all. It was layers upon layers of subtle sound that my city-damaged ears had forgotten how to process. The drip of moisture from branches, the distant rhythm of a woodpecker, the soft breath of wind through needles, and beneath it all a kind of humming aliveness that I'd never experienced anywhere else. I found deer tracks my first morning and followed them for nearly 2 miles before losing the trail in a rocky stream bed. I misidentified black bear prints as something else entirely. I wandered in circles, got turned around twice despite my compass, and returned to my cabin exhausted and frustrated, but also strangely at peace. The forest demanded so much of my attention that there was no room left for the dark thoughts that usually plagued me. Each day I improved marginally. I learned to see tracks not as isolated marks but as pieces of a continuous story. I studied pressure releases, the subtle ridges and depressions that revealed how an animal was moving, whether it was walking or running, relaxed or alarmed. I measured stride lengths and straddle widths. I examined broken twigs and bent grass, learning how long it took vegetation to recover from disturbance. The forest began to feel less like chaos and more like text in a language I was slowly learning to read. By day 4, something strange happened. I was practicing in a boggy area about a mile from my cabin, working on reading elk sign, when I came across a track that stopped me cold. It was pressed deep into the mud, partially filled with water, but the shape was unmistakable. It looked almost human. 5 toes, a clear heel impression, a general planter shape. But the size was all wrong. This print was easily 18 inches long, maybe 7 inches wide. Far too large for any human foot. My first thought was bear. Black bears have feet that can look surprisingly humanoid, especially when the print is degraded by weather. I'd read about this, seen diagrams. I tried to convince myself that's what I was seeing. But there was a problem. The stride length. Whatever made this track had been walking with strides of nearly 5 feet. A bear simply doesn't move that way. I stood there for a long time staring at that print. My rational mind offered explanations. A hoax, a weird natural formation, some combination of overlapping animal tracks that just happened to look this way. But something deeper, some instinct I'd learned to trust in the jungle, told me I was looking at something real, something I couldn't explain. I photographed the print, measured it, sketched it in my notebook and tried to continue my practice. But the image stayed with me. That night, lying in my cabin listening to the rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest held secrets I wasn't prepared for. Over the next several days, I threw myself into systematic work. I created a grid pattern around my cabin, dividing the territory into sectors that I explored methodically. I mapped animal trails, identified feeding areas and bedding sites, tracked the daily movements of the deer population that lived nearby. My skills sharpened with each passing day. The forest was becoming readable, its patterns emerging from what had seemed like randomness. And then, on day 9, I found another one. This print was clearer than the first, preserved in sticky mud near a small stream. There was no mistaking it this time. 5 distinct toes, a massive heel, a print that could only have been made by something walking upright on 2 legs. Something enormous. I measured carefully, 18.5 inches long, 7.25 inches wide. The depth of the impression suggested tremendous weight, far more than any human could possess. My military training kicked in fully. I documented everything. Multiple photographs from different angles, precise measurements, notes on soil composition and moisture content. I searched for additional prints and found 3 more, forming a trail that headed deeper into the old growth. The stride length was consistent, nearly 5 feet between each step. Whatever made these tracks stood at least 8 feet tall. I followed the trail with a mixture of excitement and something I hadn't felt since combat, the heightened awareness that comes from tracking something dangerous. But was it dangerous? The prints showed a creature moving carefully, deliberately, avoiding dry branches that would crack underfoot, choosing soft ground that would cushion its steps. This wasn't the blundering path of a bear or the careless trail of a deer. This was expert movement, the kind of stealth that takes years of practice to achieve. The trail led me deep into old-growth forest, through cathedral groves of ancient cedars, where the canopy blocked most of the gray sky and the air felt thick with age. And then, in a rocky stream bed, the trail simply vanished. Whatever I'd been following had stepped into the water and disappeared, leaving no trace of which direction it had gone. I stood there for an hour, searching upstream and downstream, examining every bank for an exit point. Nothing. The creature had vanished like smoke. That evening I mentioned the tracks to Harlan, tried to keep my voice casual, like it was just a curiosity, but Harlan's reaction told me everything I needed to know. His weathered face went still, and his eyes found mine with an intensity that hadn't been there before. "You been tracking them prints?" he asked, and it wasn't really a question. I admitted I had. Harlan was quiet for a long moment, then walked to his window, and looked out at the forest slowly disappearing into evening darkness. He told me that people had been seeing things in these woods for as long as anyone could remember. The Quileute and Maka tribes had names for these creatures, stories that went back countless generations. Most folks dismissed the tales as legend, but the old-timers knew better. Harlan himself had seen something back in 1957. Just a glimpse through the trees, a shape that was wrong too big, moving in ways that bears don't move. He'd never forgotten it. Then he turned to me with a warning I should have heeded more carefully. They don't take kindly to being followed. They value their privacy, and they've got ways of discouraging curiosity that you don't want to experience. He paused, and something flickered across his face. But sometimes they take an interest in a person. And that's a different thing altogether. I pressed him for more, but he'd said all he intended to say. I returned to my cabin with my mind racing. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake replaying every detail of those tracks, analyzing the movement patterns, marveling at the sophistication of the creature's woodcraft. Whatever had made those prints understood tracking and concealment better than any human I'd ever encountered, including the best scouts in my ranger unit. By morning, I'd made a decision. I would extend my stay as long as necessary. I wasn't just practicing tracking anymore, I was pursuing something specific, something that might be the most significant discovery of my lifetime. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a quieter voice whispered something I wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. Whatever I was tracking had almost certainly been tracking me back this whole time. The next week established a rhythm I hadn't expected. I would wake before dawn, brew coffee in the cabin's tiny kitchen, and venture into the forest while the mist still clung to the ferns like gossamer curtains. My afternoons were spent reviewing notes, comparing tracks, and trying to make sense of what I was learning. And every evening, I'd sit on Harlan's porch, saying little, watching the shadows deepen between the ancient trees. But here's what changed during that week. I stopped thinking of myself as the hunter. Somewhere in those endless green corridors, the dynamic had shifted. I was still tracking, still following sign, still documenting everything with the methodical precision my military training had instilled. But I began to understand that every trail I followed had been deliberately laid out for me to find. Every track, every broken twig, every subtle disturbance in the forest floor was part of a curriculum I was only beginning to comprehend. Day 16 brought the revelation that altered everything. I had been following what I thought was a promising trail since early morning. The prints were clearer than usual, pressed deep into the loamy soil after a night of light rain. I tracked them for nearly 3 miles, moving deeper into old growth than I'd ventured before. The trees here were massive, some of them over 300 years old, their trunks wider than my pickup truck. Sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, leaving the forest floor in perpetual twilight. The trail led me to a rocky outcropping, and there it simply vanished. One moment the tracks were clear and readable, the next they were gone, as if the creature had simply ceased to exist. I searched for an hour, expanding my circle, checking every possible route. Nothing. On my way back, frustrated and tired, I found another set of prints. These led in a completely different direction. I followed them, and 2 miles later, they too disappeared at a stream crossing. The water was too shallow for the creature to have used it as an escape route, and the banks on either side showed no exit point. I sat on a fallen log and stared at my notebook, at the maps I'd drawn, at the patterns I'd recorded, and suddenly, with the force of a physical blow, I understood. These weren't escape routes, they were lessons. The creature wasn't evading me, It was teaching me. Every false trail, every vanishing act, every impossible disappearance was a master class in concealment techniques. I was being shown step by step how an expert hides its passage. The rocky outcropping eliminated pressure tracks. The stream crossing used water not for escape, but as a demonstration of how to break a trail without leaving evidence. I laughed out loud, the sound strange and foreign in that silent cathedral of trees. Here I was, thinking I was tracking this creature, when all along it was patiently, deliberately educating me, like a professor who lets a student struggle with a problem until the moment of revelation comes from within. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with the implications. This wasn't animal behavior. This was pedagogy. This was intentional communication. And it meant that whatever was out there possessed not just intelligence, but a desire to teach, to share knowledge, to connect. The gift arrived on the morning of day 17. I emerged from the cabin just after sunrise, coffee in hand, and stopped dead on the porch. There, placed with obvious intention at the top of the steps, lay a rabbit, freshly killed, perhaps only hours old. No signs of disease or trap damage. A clean kill by something with incredible strength and precision. I looked around the clearing. The morning mist still hung in the air, diffusing the early light into something dreamlike. And there, in the soft earth just beyond the porch, I saw it. A single footprint, massive, perfect, unmistakable. It was positioned to be seen, left deliberately as a signature on this offering. I knew what this was. In many cultures, predators share food with those they accept into their circle. This was communication of the most primal kind. The creature was saying, I know where you are. I can reach you anytime, and I choose to bring you sustenance, not harm. I stood there for a long time, the coffee growing cold in my hand, staring at that rabbit and that footprint. Finally, I picked up the rabbit and prepared it for cooking. It felt like a sacred act, accepting this gift, acknowledging the message it carried. 3 days later came the second gift. This time, I found a bundle of herbs and plants on my porch, bound together with some kind of natural fiber. I recognized some of them from my survival training. Yarrow for wounds, mint for digestion, a type of moss that served as natural antiseptic. Others I didn't know, but would later identify as plants with medicinal properties the local tribes had used for centuries. This wasn't a predator bringing prey, this was a healer sharing medicine. The implication staggered me. I decided to respond. That afternoon, I took one of the apples I'd brought from town and walked to the edge of the clearing. I placed it there carefully, a small red sphere against the dark earth, and then retreated to my cabin to watch. Nothing happened that day, or that night, as far as I could tell, but the next morning, the apple was gone. In its place lay a stone, small enough to fit in my palm, worked into a deliberate shape. It wasn't carved in any sophisticated way, but the form was unmistakable. It was a footprint, a tiny replica of those massive tracks I'd been following for weeks, a symbol of the creature itself, given freely. I held that stone, and felt the weight of communication across the vast gulf between our species. This was language. Primitive, perhaps, simple, but undeniably intentional. We were talking to each other. After that, I changed my approach entirely. I stopped tracking, stopped searching, stopped the active pursuit that had defined my weeks in this forest. Instead, I began to simply be present. I would find a comfortable spot against a tree, settle myself into stillness, and observe. Hours would pass. Sometimes, entire days. I watched the light change, the animals pass, the forest breathe around me. This was harder than any tracking I'd done. My military training had taught me to act, to pursue, to accomplish objectives, but now I was learning something different. I was learning to receive instead of take, to wait instead of chase, to earn through patience what could never be captured through force. Days passed in this meditation. My mind, so restless at first, gradually quieted. I began to notice things I'd previously missed. The way certain birds served as sentinels for the entire forest, their alarm calls rippling outward to warn every creature of potential danger. The way the wind carried not just sound, but information, messages written in scent and temperature that I could only dimly perceive. The way the forest had its own rhythm, its own heartbeat, and how all its inhabitants moved in relation to that pulse. I understood, finally, what was happening. I was being tested, not for my tracking skills, which were laughably inadequate compared to what this creature possessed. I was being evaluated for something else entirely: my patience, my respect, my willingness to set aside my human arrogance and become a student instead of a conqueror. The sighting came on day 24. The afternoon had turned golden, that magical hour when the sun angles through the canopy and transforms the forest into something from a painting. I had been sitting against an old cedar for nearly 2 hours, so still that a beetle had crawled across my hand without alarm. My breathing had slowed to match the rhythm of the woods. I had become, as much as any human can, part of the landscape. Movement flickered at the edge of my vision, perhaps 200 feet away, in a small gap between the massive trunks. Every instinct screamed at me to turn, to look, to focus on what my peripheral vision was registering. But some deeper wisdom kept me still. I continued staring straight ahead, letting my peripheral vision do the work. A shape emerged from behind a hemlock, massive, at least 8 feet tall, perhaps more, covered in dark hair that caught the golden light and shimmered with subtle reddish highlights. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large, each step placed with exquisite precision, and then it stopped. It turned, and it looked directly at me. Even at that distance, I felt the weight of that gaze. This was not the blank stare of an animal assessing a potential threat or prey. This was evaluation, consideration, recognition. Intelligence looked out from those deep-set eyes, an intelligence ancient and patient, and utterly unlike anything human, yet somehow, impossibly, familiar. We remained that way for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Neither of us moved. Neither of us broke the connection. I felt tears streaming down my face, though I couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was the overwhelming proof that the world was larger and stranger and more wonderful than anything I'd believed. Perhaps it was the recognition of something I'd been searching for my whole life without knowing it. And then, with that same fluid grace, it turned and melted back into the forest. One moment it was there, the next it was simply gone, as if the trees had absorbed it back into themselves. I don't know how long I sat there after. The light faded. The temperature dropped. Stars appeared in the gaps of the canopy. Still I didn't move, afraid that any action would break the spell, would prove that what I'd seen was just a dream. When I finally walked back to my cabin, I was a different man than the one who had left that morning. The world had cracked open and shown me something precious hiding beneath its surface. Everything I thought I knew about tracking, about nature, about the boundaries between human and other, had been revealed as laughably incomplete. I understood now what had been happening these past weeks. The tracks, the gifts, the lessons in concealment, the patient evaluation of my character, it had all been leading to this moment, to this test which I had somehow passed, and now I sensed with every fiber of my being, something new was about to begin. I was right. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next, for the education I was about to receive, for the truths that would transform my understanding not just of this creature, but of the very nature of knowledge itself. Those next weeks would change me in ways I still struggle to articulate, even after all these years, because what Old Father showed me wasn't just better tracking techniques, it was a completely different way of seeing the world. The new dynamic between us established itself gradually, like water finding its path through stone. There was never a formal arrangement, no handshake or agreement, but over the following days the encounters became more frequent, more deliberate, more clearly purposeful. Old Father was no longer simply observing me from a distance, he was engaging with me, and the distinction mattered enormously. I still never approached him directly. That boundary remained sacred, unspoken but absolute. Instead, he would leave trails for me to follow, and these trails were unlike anything I had encountered in my weeks of practice. Each one was a lesson wrapped in an enigma, a puzzle that required me to expand my understanding of what tracking even meant. The first of these teaching trails appeared on a crisp October morning. I found it near the stream where I had discovered those early prints, a series of tracks that led northeast into a section of forest I hadn't yet explored. What struck me immediately was the intentionality of it. These weren't the tracks of a creature simply moving through its territory. These were tracks placed with purpose, each step deliberate, each placement communicating something specific. I followed them for nearly 2 hours, and during that time I learned more than I had in all my previous weeks combined. The trail led me to a hidden spring I never would have found on my own, fresh water bubbling up through moss-covered rocks in a depression so concealed by undergrowth that you could walk within 10 feet of it and never know it existed. Old Father had shown me how to read the forest for resources, how to identify the subtle signs that indicate water even when no water is visible. But the lesson didn't end there. The trail continued, and now the tracks changed character entirely. Where before they had been relatively easy to follow, clear impressions in soft earth, now they became increasingly difficult to detect. Old Father was teaching me to see the invisible, to read the signs that most trackers would dismiss as noise. A bent fern frond here, angled in a direction inconsistent with wind or natural growth. A stone turned slightly, its damp underside now facing upward. The faintest disturbance in a patch of moss, the kind of subtle compression that most eyes would never register. I learned to see these things because Old Father forced me to see them, because the trail would simply end unless I expanded my perception to include them. This was the pattern of my education. Each trail built upon the previous one, each lesson layered atop earlier understanding. I began keeping detailed notes, coded in a personal shorthand I developed specifically for this purpose, not because I feared anyone reading them, but because some of what I was learning felt too sacred to record in plain language. I learned about pressure releases, those tiny ridges and valleys in a track that reveal how the creature was moving, what it was feeling, whether it was calm or alarmed, tired or energized. The books I had brought with me touched on this concept, but Old Father showed me depths that no human author had ever approached. I learned to read the story of a track the way a scholar reads ancient text, extracting meaning from the smallest details, understanding that nothing in the forest is accidental. Weather interpretation became another crucial element of my education. Old Father would leave trails that led me to observe specific phenomena, teaching me to predict rain by watching animal behavior hours before the first clouds appeared. I learned to read wind patterns through the movement of branches, to understand how temperature and humidity affected tracking conditions, to adjust my approach based on factors I had never previously considered. Sound patterns entered my awareness with new significance. The forest is never truly silent, I discovered. It speaks constantly in a language of bird calls and insect rhythms, of rustling leaves and creaking branches. Old Father taught me to hear this language, to recognize when the forest's voice changed, when alarm rippled through the ecosystem, when peace settled over the land. I learned to identify creatures by sound alone, to know what moved through the underbrush without ever seeing it. But the most profound lessons were those that transcended technique entirely. Old Father was showing me how to become part of the forest rather than merely moving through it. This required a fundamental shift in consciousness, a surrendering of the ego-driven approach that characterizes most human interaction with wilderness. I had to stop thinking of myself as separate from my environment and begin experiencing myself as a participant in something vast and interconnected. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It emerged gradually through countless hours of patient observation, through failures that taught as much as successes, through moments of frustration that gave way to unexpected clarity. There were days when I felt I was making no progress at all, when the lessons seemed beyond my capacity to understand. And then there were breakthrough moments, instances of sudden comprehension that made all the struggle worthwhile. One such moment came about 3 weeks into this intensive education. I had been following a particularly challenging trail for most of the morning, repeatedly losing it and backtracking, growing increasingly frustrated with my limitations. Then something shifted inside me. I stopped thinking about the tracks as marks on the ground and began feeling them as disturbances in the forest's energy. I cannot explain this better than that. The intellectual understanding gave way to something intuitive, something that bypassed the analytical mind entirely. From that moment forward, I never lost a trail the same way again. Not because I had become a better technical tracker, though that was certainly true, but because I had accessed a different way of knowing, a perception that existed beneath conscious thought. Old Father had been leading me toward this breakthrough all along. The first verbal communication between us came during my 4th week of intensive learning. I use the term verbal loosely because what passed between us bore little resemblance to human speech. I was following one of his lesson trails through a particularly dense section of old growth when I heard a sound that stopped me cold. It was deep and resonant, almost subsonic, a vocalization that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. The sound conveyed warning, unmistakably and urgently. I froze, scanning the area around me without moving my head, trying to identify the threat. Then I looked up, and my heart nearly stopped. Directly above me hung a massive dead branch, what loggers call a widowmaker. The wind was picking up, and the branch was swaying dangerously. One strong gust and it would have come down directly on my position. I moved quickly but carefully out of the danger zone, and as I did, I caught a glimpse of Old Father watching from perhaps 50 yards away. He had saved my life. More than that, he had demonstrated something crucial about the nature of our relationship. We were no longer simply teacher and student. We were something closer to partners, connected by bonds that transcended the obvious differences between us. After that incident, the distance between us shrank noticeably. Old Father allowed himself to be seen more frequently, more clearly. I began to understand his physical form in ways that initial glimpse had not permitted. He stood somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall, his body covered in dark reddish-brown hair that varied in length across different regions. His face was remarkably expressive, with deep-set eyes that communicated intelligence and emotion far beyond what I had imagined possible. I began calling him Old Father in my thoughts during those weeks, and the name felt right in a way I cannot fully explain. It carried respect without worship, acknowledged his role as teacher without diminishing my own agency. One afternoon, sitting quietly in a clearing we had both come to frequent, I spoke the name aloud for the first time, just those 2 words, offered to the forest like a gift. That night, as I lay in my cabin preparing for sleep, I heard a response from somewhere nearby. 2 syllables, repeated 3 times, the sound shaped by a mouth never designed for human speech. But the intention was unmistakable. He was saying my name, or his version of it. Marcus. We had exchanged names. We had acknowledged each other as individuals worthy of identification. I documented everything during this period, filling notebook after notebook with observations, insights, questions. The depth of knowledge Old Father possessed exceeded anything I had imagined possible. He could read trails that were days old, extracting information from signs so subtle that I could barely perceive it, even when he pointed it out. He understood the forest as a living system in ways that made human ecology seem primitive by comparison. But the most stunning revelation came one evening in late November. I had noticed other movement in the forest over the preceding days, glimpses and sounds that suggested Old Father was not alone. That evening my suspicions were confirmed in spectacular fashion. As the light faded toward dusk, 3 figures emerged from the tree line perhaps 100 yards from where I sat. Old Father was immediately recognizable by his size and the particular way he moved. But beside him walked a smaller individual, clearly female, her hair slightly lighter in color, her movements possessing a grace that seemed almost supernatural, and between them, partially hidden by their protective positioning, moved a juvenile. A family. Old Father had a family. They stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, allowing themselves to be seen, and I understood that this was another gift, another extension of trust. I remained absolutely still, barely breathing, overwhelmed by the privilege of what I was witnessing. Then, as silently as they had appeared, they faded back into the forest. I had been accepted into something sacred, granted access to mysteries that few humans had ever witnessed. But I could not have known then that this deepening connection would soon be tested, that forces were already moving toward this wilderness that would threaten everything I had come to cherish. The crisis that followed would demand more of me than I had ever given to anything in my life, and it would reveal the true depth of the bond between Old Father and myself, a bond forged in patient teaching and about to be tempered in the fire of desperate protection. The hunters arrived in December of 1981, and I recognized them immediately for what they were. 4 men with expensive equipment and professional bearing, the kind of quiet confidence that comes from operating in shadows where normal rules do not apply. I had served alongside men like these in the military, men who approached every mission with cold efficiency and asked no questions about the larger purpose. They checked into the only motel in Forks, and within hours the town was buzzing with curiosity about these outsiders asking strange questions. I first encountered them at the general store where I had begun purchasing supplies on credit. My meager savings from warehouse work stretched thin but supplemented now by odd jobs for Harlan. They were questioning the owner about unusual sightings in the forest, large animals behaving strangely, anything out of the ordinary. Their questions were carefully worded to sound casual, but I heard the precision beneath the surface. These men knew exactly what they were looking for. That evening I observed them unloading equipment at the motel: motion-activated cameras, audio recording devices, thermal imaging gear that seemed beyond what any civilian researcher should possess. My military training had taught me to recognize government hardware, and while nothing bore official markings, the quality was unmistakable. These were not amateur enthusiasts chasing legends. This was a professional operation with serious backing and serious intentions. I spent a sleepless night wrestling with what to do. My instinct screamed at me to warn Old Father immediately, but I forced myself to think strategically. Rushing into the forest in a panic would accomplish nothing, and might actually lead these hunters directly to what they sought. Instead, I needed information. I needed to understand their methods, their timeline, their ultimate objective. Only then could I formulate an effective defense. Over the following days, I positioned myself as a friendly local, just another curious resident fascinated by the mysterious visitors. I bought them drinks at the small tavern, asked innocent questions about their research, expressed skeptical amusement at the idea of anything unusual in our forests. The leader, a man named Patterson, was guarded but not entirely unfriendly. He revealed nothing directly, but I learned to read the gaps in his conversation, the subjects he steered away from, the glances exchanged between team members when certain topics arose. What I pieced together chilled me to the bone. This was not their first expedition. They had been tracking reports of large unidentified primates across the Pacific Northwest for years, narrowing their search through systematic elimination. The Olympic Peninsula represented their most promising lead, and they had allocated significant resources to this particular operation. When I asked, as casually as I could manage, what they intended to do if they found something, Patterson smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. "Science requires specimens," he said. "Proper examination, definitive proof." I understood then that they would not be content with photographs or recordings. They wanted a body. Whether captured alive or killed made little difference to them, though I suspected the latter would be simpler for their purposes. Old Father, his mate, his child, the entire community I had been privileged to witness, they were all in mortal danger from men who saw them as nothing more than scientific curiosities to be collected and dissected. The next morning I ventured into the forest with an urgency I had never felt before. I used every signal Old Father had taught me, every vocalization and gesture that might convey the critical nature of my message. For hours I moved through the trees, calling out in ways that would have seemed like madness to anyone observing, and finally, as afternoon light began to fade, Old Father appeared. He was different that day, and I knew immediately that he already sensed the threat. His posture held a tension I had never seen, a coiled readiness that spoke of ancient defensive instincts. We stood facing each other in a small clearing, and I struggled to communicate what I had learned. I spoke in simple words, supplemented by gestures, by pointing back toward town, by mimicking the hunters and their equipment. I showed him my fear, my concern, my desperate desire to help. What happened next remains the most profound moment of connection in my entire life. Old Father stepped forward, crossing the careful distance we had always maintained, and placed his massive hand against my chest. I felt the warmth of his palm over my heart, felt the surprising gentleness of that touch from a being strong enough to tear a man apart without effort. Then he placed that same hand over his own heart, holding my gaze with those ancient eyes. The meaning was unmistakable. We are connected. We are one in this. In that moment I understood that our relationship had transcended teacher and student. We were allies now, bound by something deeper than shared knowledge. And I knew with absolute certainty that I would do whatever necessary to protect him and his family, regardless of the cost to myself. The following weeks became the most intense of my life. I operated on two fronts simultaneously, gathering intelligence from the hunters while working with Old Father to relocate his family deeper into the wilderness. Patterson's team was methodical, setting up a grid pattern of cameras and sensors that slowly closed around the territory where I had first found those massive footprints. But I had advantages they could not have anticipated. I knew the forest now in ways that went beyond any map or survey, and I had a guide whose knowledge of this land stretched back generations beyond counting. I became a saboteur, though I prefer to think of it as misdirection. Cameras were moved to face empty clearings. Audio equipment recorded only wind and birdsong because I had warned Old Father which areas to avoid. I created false trails using the very skills I had been taught, laying down evidence that led the hunters in circles, always away from the true location of those I protected. Every trick of concealment Old Father had shown me, I now employed in reverse, not hiding my own passage but fabricating signs of passage that did not exist. The hunters grew frustrated but did not give up. Patterson, in particular, sensed that something was wrong with their operation. On a cold evening in late December, he cornered me outside the tavern, his friendly facade finally dropping away to reveal the steel beneath. "You have been spending a lot of time in those forests, Marcus," he said, using my name in a way that told me he had investigated my background. "A man with your training would make an excellent tracker. I wonder if perhaps you have found something you are not sharing with us." I held his gaze without flinching, drawing on every ounce of discipline the Army had instilled in me. "There is nothing out there but bears and elk," I told him. "Whatever you are looking for does not exist." Patterson smiled that cold smile again. "We both know that is not true," he said, "and when we find them, and we will find them, we will have our answers." One way or another, the threat in his words was barely veiled. That night I made a journey deeper into the wilderness than I had ever ventured before. Old Father had shown me the way during our sabotage operations, a hidden valley accessible only through a series of nearly invisible trails. The family had relocated there, and I needed to warn them that the hunters were becoming desperate, more dangerous. What awaited me in that valley defied everything I thought I understood. Old Father had gathered not just his immediate family but what I can only describe as his extended clan. 9 individuals stood in the darkness, ranging from a juvenile barely taller than myself to beings of tremendous age, whose faces carried the weight of centuries. They had never shown themselves to me like this, never revealed the true size of their community. This was not simply a meeting, this was a farewell and a thank you, offered in the only way they could. In the darkness of that valley, surrounded by beings who had watched humanity rise from primitive beginnings, I received something I still struggle to articulate. Old Father communicated with me not in words but in something deeper, a transfer of meaning through gesture and vocalization and intention that bypassed language entirely. What he shared was nothing less than the history of his people, stretching back through millennia to a time when humans and his kind had lived in connection, in understanding before something fundamental changed in the human heart. His people had chosen a different path than ours. When our ancestors reached for tools and fire, for dominion over nature, his ancestors reached for something else entirely. They became guardians of the balance, protectors of wild places, keepers of wisdom that humanity had abandoned in its rush toward progress. They watched us spread across the world, and they retreated into the remaining wilderness, heartbroken by what their cousins had become. That night, Old Father showed me how they truly perceived the forest, and for one transcendent moment, I glimpsed it myself. Not just tracks and sign, not just the physical evidence of passage, but something more profound: energy, memory, intention. Every creature that moves through the forest leaves an imprint beyond the physical, an emotional signature written in the very fabric of the land. Fear leaves one mark, peace leaves another. The forest remembers everything, and Old Father's people can read it all, a living library of meaning stretching back to the dawn of time. This is why he chose to teach me, not simply to make me a better tracker, but to awaken in me a way of seeing that humans once possessed and abandoned. I was being initiated into an ancient understanding, offered a gift that carried tremendous responsibility. But with this revelation came a warning that still haunts my nights. The balance is failing, Old Father communicated. Too much has been taken from the wild places. His people are fewer with each generation. The old knowledge fades, and soon, perhaps within a span of time that means nothing to beings who measure lives in centuries, but everything to creatures like us, there will be none of them left. The guardians will be gone. And what then for a world that has forgotten how to see? I wept that night for the first time since Vietnam. I wept for the beauty I had been shown, and the loss I now understood was coming. I asked what I could do, one small human against the tide of destruction my species had unleashed. Old Father's response was simple, and has guided every day of my life since. Remember, teach, protect. He gave me a parting gift that I wear to this day, hidden beneath my shirt where no one can see. A stone pendant shaped by hands older than any human civilization, worn smooth by generations of touching. A symbol of our connection, our covenant. As long as this exists, he communicated, so do we and you. When the hunters finally left in January of 1982, frustrated and empty-handed, I had won. But victories against such forces are never permanent. I returned to Ohio briefly, finalized my divorce, quit my meaningless job, and moved permanently to the Pacific Northwest. I became a forest ranger, the perfect cover for a guardian's work. For 40 years I have protected these forests. I have misdirected researchers, discouraged development, fought quietly against every encroachment into the wild places. Several more teams have come over the decades, some government-backed, some private, all seeking proof of what I know to be true. None have gotten close, and on rare occasions in the deepest reaches of the forest, I have met again with Old Father, each reunion more precious than the last, as I watch time claim even his seemingly eternal form. I am 71 years old now, and my journey is nearly complete. I have never shared this story publicly, never sought recognition or validation, but the weight of keeping such knowledge has grown too heavy, and I believe the world needs to know what might still exist in our remaining wild places, not to hunt or capture or prove, but to protect, to remember that we are not alone on this earth, that wisdom exists beyond human understanding, and that some mysteries deserve to remain mysterious. I still wear the pendant Old Father gave me, and sometimes in the quiet moments before dawn, I can almost see the forest the way he taught me. The tracks that carry meaning beyond the physical, the stories written in bent grass and disturbed earth, the memory of the land itself. This is my legacy, the knowledge that we are connected to something ancient and profound, and the responsibility to protect it until my final breath. Remember, teach, protect. These words have been my compass for 40 years. May they guide whoever hears this story toward the same purpose.